There are a lot of people out there who need our help. We do know that. And it is a matter for us of trying to prioritize what we have to do.
The insurance industry in work comp, however, is doing quite well, and has for the last 5 or 6 years. It's enabled them to cut premiums, actually. And one of our big missions is to get the private sector to maintain its role as an adequate safety net for those that get hurt at work. What we've been seeing, and one of the driving forces that made this group happen, is seeing the private sector oftentimes skate out of their responsibility and push these injured people onto the public welfare roles, putting additional strain on the public welfare. So that's one of our big missions. So if you see legislature coming your way, sponsored by this group, that's what it's about. We want to try to efficientize the work comp system and get the private sector to do its job. You know, the loss ratio for HIWA 2 years ago, I don't know about last year because those numbers aren't out yet, was only about 28% of a premium dollar they were paying out in benefits to injured workers, including disability and health care. So they're doing quite well. And this is kind of the essence of what our group is trying to accomplish when you see legislature coming your way.
It's interesting when you mention HIWA because, you know, HIWA was a creation of the fact it was supposed to salvage work comp. And everybody who was not being able to be insured by any of the normal insurance carriers were supposed to go into HIWA. HIWA was sort of
non-profit.
Right. That's right. Yeah, right. It was like our creation, right?
That's right. It's done its job too well and become an 800-pound gorilla now.
Everybody who was not being able to be insured by any of the normal insurance carriers were supposed to go into HIWA. HIWA was sort of
non-profit.
That's right. Yeah, right. It was like our creation, right?
HIWA was well intended. It really was well intended. And then all we get is the wrath of everyone saying, "You guys just don't know what you're doing half the time."
Premiums were so high, and it was the employers that felt the pressure of that, right? And so they came in and they said, hey, the benefits are too generous, or you have too much fraud, right? So blame it on the worker, blame it on the injured worker, right? So this was a mechanism to place a check on the industry, because the industry always showed us their underwriting, right, experience, which showed a loss. But what they weren't showing was the money that they keep and invest and make a return on. And so the law was actually changed to provide for greater accountability. But yeah, you know, what was a mechanism to place, you know, that kind of a check really has changed into something much more, and you're seeing some of the consequences of that too.
One thing that it kind of frees us up to do is to do more creative legislation.
The only reason why Senate Bill 692 passed last year, and it provided some protection for those injured workers who otherwise, through IMEs and stuff, were getting their medical cut off, you know, unilaterally, right? All they did was get an IME, that was justification, and boom, you know, without any input from anybody else. Okay, so there's some protection that was put into place through the legislation last year, but it had to still overcome the governor's veto. To me, if it wasn't for what the Senate did 2 years earlier, and what they did, you know, because usually when you get to overcoming veto, the practice in the past had been the House and the Senate have to get together and decide which bills are going to be overridden, which vetoes are going to be overridden. And it really was by joint mutual decision making, and therefore it was another mechanism for minimizing the number of bills, you know, or the number of vetoes, I'm sorry, that got overridden. And, you know, actually it was through leadership provided in the Senate 2 years ago that changed that process and said, look, the House, you can decide what bills you're going to, what vetoes you want to override. But the Senate has voted on these bills and passed them once before and are going to stand on the principle of consistency and, you know, take a vote to override, you know, those bills. And the House actually didn't 2 years ago, you know. And I think people began questioning, look, you passed this legislation one time through. Why now, only because the governor is vetoing it, are you not willing to stand up to the vote you made earlier and overcome that, especially if the legislative body is supposed to be the policy-making body, you know, rather than the administration of the governor. And so, but until then, because of the joint decision-making, you know, that's how many bills that otherwise might have passed, you know, final reading, you know, didn't. And so when the Senate 2 years ago decided to go on their own,
That's right.
right? Because leadership said, well, we've been doing it this way, but we're going to do it different. It sort of exposed the House to, why aren't you guys doing the same thing the Senate is doing? You know, because you voted on that, you passed it the first time. What is different now? Including the work comp legislation, we're going to vote to override. And what I think that did was place a lot of pressure on the House that had not done it, you know, the year before, had gotten the criticism because why have a supermajority here? You know, you're supposed to have, right? Everybody fights during campaign for 2/3 in the Senate, 2/3 in the House. If you're not going to exercise, you know, that potential authority, why have it? And I think, given the criticism, the House was more than willing to,
They did.
yeah, override the bill.
And I think it originated with Dwight when he was in the House, was this idea that the administration was trying to basically affect work comp rights through rules. And what we ended up doing was prohibiting the rulemaking. We prohibited it. Yeah, we said you can't do it. Remember, the trade-off for work comp has always been, you don't get to sue your employer because you have work comp. But if you don't have work comp, and it's really a bad situation, why shouldn't you be able to sue your employer? Your employer's going to say, hey, work comp is exclusive remedy, you can't sue me. But if you can't get the exclusive remedy, then why shouldn't you be able to sue? And maybe what we need to start to look at is an advocacy and ombudsman situation for that kind of claims or something along those lines. I'm saying is now is the time. Let's think out of the box. Let's think about how we can address this. Let's go to the basics, like when we went back and looked at what was HIWA created for, right? And everybody goes, wow, it was created for that. Let's go back and look at what was work comp created for. Work comp was created as a trade-off. It was because remember how workers used to get injured and killed in the old days because of working conditions, and they said, well, if your employees can sue you, your business is going to go under. So what do? You get work comp. That's why the idea on work comp was supposed to be that if you're injured on the job, no questions asked. What we're having over the period of time, though, is it's almost a reverse standard. You're denied, and then you have to prove entitlement. That's not what these benefits were intended to do. So let's go back and let's re-explore what the basis of the benefits were, and then move from there.
You need the injured workers to call their legislators and say, hey, this is what's happened to me. This is what's going on. The HEMICs and the Liberty Mutuals and these other scallywags, as I like to call them, you know, they need to be held accountable. And in addition to accountability, I think they need to share in the profits that they've earned for years. You know, we see by these numbers, premiums have gone down 60%. We know that they've been making millions and millions and millions of profits. And I think that there ought to be a mechanism where they ought to be taxed for those profits. And I hope that you will look at that. That's the way to get money.
Insurance companies, as you know, don't pay a tax per se. They don't pay GET, they don't pay some of these other types of, because they got the exemption.
That the insurance company agents make are only taxed at like 0.00015 or something like that, where I'm being taxed 4.5%
Right.
plus,
Right.
whatever. I'm going, why?
That's exactly right. And like I said, these are the times when we will start to look at those kinds of issues. But you're absolutely right.
A lot of the insurance companies will not pay that excise tax. It goes to the person who's sick or injured. They pay that tax.
I thank Senator Hanabusa, and I want each one of you to talk to 100 friends and family. Make sure that they vote for Senator Hanabusa when he runs for Congress. Okay? I want to thank Senator Takamine also for coming and helping us out. Similarly, for you people who are on workers' comp or have been injured, the lawyers here and the other practitioners here are working on bills to help you people out in the next legislative session.